that you and your family will plan to be a part of that. We will, during that service, observe the Lord's Supper together, and a special time for us as a church family to come together to remember and to reflect upon the sacrifice of our Lord and Savior Jesus, and then together through doing that to worship through the partaking of the Lord's Supper. Also on Saturday at 10 o'clock and going until 11:30, there will be an Easter egg hunt for the children at Jeremy and Ashley Flores' home. The instructions are that each child needs to bring 10 candy-filled eggs. So that's per child, not per family. So if you have 3 children coming, you need to bring 30 candy-filled eggs to that. Also want to remind you of the Annie Armstrong Easter offering going on right now. And just remind you that there's a great opportunity for you to be a part of what God is doing in a variety of ways. You can give financially, but you can also pray, and that goes a long ways as you pray for those who are serving in our country. Also want to remind you that there is a ladies' tea party, or get-together, on Sunday, April the 7th at 2 o'clock in Bibb Hall. Miss Jane Robertson will be speaking. If I understood this correctly, it's here. It says she will be speaking about being a virtuous woman. And I think that she's well qualified to speak about that. And I know that you will be encouraged if you come to that. There is a sign-up sheet on the bulletin board, and donations will be accepted there to cover the cost for the things that will take place that day. Also, there's a kids' movie night on Saturday, April the 13th from 6 to 7:30. I'm sure that more information will be released about that. That's all that I have here in front of me. So tune your ear to hear more updates and details about that. Maybe put it on your calendar if you have children that you would like to be a part of that. And then also a reminder that we will have church Bible drills next Wednesday night. And then associational drills are on the 14th of April at 2 o'clock at Walthall Baptist Church. Those are the announcements. I know that there are quite a few. I'm pausing now to see if you have anything to add or something that perhaps I left off or forgot to mention. It's quiet again. So I perceive that to mean that there's nothing to be added, and so I will transition now to talk about tonight. Let me begin by saying this. Behind every pastor is a good pastor's wife. I could not do what I do without the support of my wife in any area of my life. And I am so thankful for her and for the way that God has used her in my life to teach me, to encourage me, to hold me accountable, and just to be present with me. And, a lot of times, maybe you don't understand this aspect of ministry, but pastors' wives see things from a different angle a lot of times. And they're a part of the ministry just as much as the pastor is, and they carry the burdens and share the load just as much as the pastor does. And I'm very thankful for my wife. A blessing of that is that oftentimes I can go home after a Wednesday night and I can share something about the message that impacted me as I was preaching. Something that maybe I didn't plan to say, but the Lord just inspired me to say as I was speaking, and it spoke to my heart. And then we will have dialogue about that. Last Wednesday night, we were in the gym. My wife had chosen to be with Holden and the children that night, so she wasn't in the gym. But I went home and I was sharing with her what I preached about. And I'll remind you, I preached about from Ecclesiastes that we can't find our identity or our purpose in work alone. Work is not a bad thing, but if that's our point of finding our purpose and identity, then we will be let down at some point, as well as other areas addressed by Solomon in Ecclesiastes as he's reflecting over his life. He's thinking about different things that he sought purpose in. We reviewed some of those. Wisdom was one of those, even though that was something granted to him by God. Even things granted to us by God, if we depend on those solely for our purpose and try to seek identity in those things rather than in the God who gave us those things, then we will be let down. Those things are not meant to satisfy or to give us purpose. They're meant to be tools and avenues of which God uses in our lives. So wisdom. We also talked about possessions and of pleasure. And then we've talked about work as well. So last week I went home and I was telling Laura Claire a little bit about the message, and she just kind of opened up and talked to me a little bit. And I asked her, I said, would you be willing next Wednesday night to share that? Would you be willing just to talk a little bit about that? And this is why I asked her to do that. I understand that many of you, and I appreciate you, listen to me when I preach. You listen to the words I say, you listen to my thoughts and my opinions, and hopefully you go and you research on your own and don't depend only on those. But I realize that there is a power in testimony and in sharing things. And I realize that a story, the way God has worked in an individual's life, will perhaps resonate with some of you better than a preacher standing up and preaching. Although that's not to diminish the importance or significance thereof, I think it is just as important to understand and to hear about how God has worked in people's lives. And so we're going to transition now. I'm going to ask Laura Claire to join me on the stage, and we're just going to have a conversation tonight. I'm going to ask a few questions and talk through this, and she's going to share a little bit about how perhaps it is that the two of us together, but her individually as well, can relate to the story of Solomon and how that pertains to identity, pursuing purpose, and all of those things caught up in there. So, thank you for loving us. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for giving us opportunity to serve you. I want you to know it is a joy and a blessing to be your pastor. And I'm looking forward to tonight and sharing how God has worked in our lives.
He could have waited until I was just a little bit more pregnant to do this, couldn't he? You'll see after tonight why the Lord called him to be the speaker out of the two of us.
All right, so we'll jump right in. Again, this is meant to be rather informal rather than formal, although it is set up to look rather formal. I'm just going to ask some questions, and she's going to respond to those, and perhaps I'll chime in if there's anything that is important from my life as well. So to begin with, as we talked about last week, just different avenues, different ways that God has perhaps in Solomon's life caused him to reflect back and see that there were different avenues, there were different pursuits or paths or different things that he sought purpose and identity in. What are the specific avenues, paths, or things that you have pursued purpose for your life in, such as like Solomon talks through wisdom, he talks through possessions or pleasures. What are some things or maybe even roles in your life that have been really important to your identity?
I don't know if you'd say I'm hard-headed or just a slow learner, but I have a pattern of continuing to try to find my identity in things that are not of the Lord. First of all, I think it came when I was in college. I found my identity being a good student. I worked my tail off to make sure that I got the best possible grades. I wanted to be the teacher's pet. I wanted to be top of the class. And then when I graduated, I really took pride in the identity of the degree that I had pursued. I was going to be a music therapist. I was all gung-ho. That's who I was. And then fast forward a few years later, and I became a mom. And I loved being a mom, but specifically, my little boy came to me. His name was Trevor, and I was Trevor's mom. And then we got two more girls. I was Chloe and Elena's mom. And we had a few other kids, but those in particular were set up, we were told from the beginning, to be long-term, and so I was their mom. And then another thing that I found my identity heavily in is I had a job as a addiction and mental health therapist, and that was part of who I was. I was a therapist. I was someone who was in the trenches every single day, and all of those things really shaped the way I viewed myself as a person.
All right, so you can hear through that there are several different things in different seasons of life that have been very important to Laura Claire that have really been an important part of her identifying who she is, meaning something to her. And so one thing I want to highlight as you listen to her, it's not that she has intentionally said, I intentionally sought after this to be who I was. I intentionally went after this degree or this job or this profession or this calling to be my identity. And a lot of times it's not that we set out with the intentions to, in these different things, pursue our purpose or to become our identity. But in the process, those things somehow or another because of the impact they have on our lives, because of what they mean to us, because of maybe the way that we feel we are able to help others through that, they can really take over and become a little bit more about our identity than what we realize. So, question number 2, in regards to that, how was your identity impacted when those things were either removed or no longer were relevant to your life, at least for a season?
So with my first degree, being a music therapist, that was the basket I put all my eggs in. I mean, I felt like the Lord absolutely led me to do that. I had complete confirmation that that's where I was supposed to be. And then I graduated and COVID hit, and they weren't adding new programs, they were cutting already established programs. And it really just felt like a betrayal from the Lord that I faithfully followed exactly where I knew He told me to go. And we got there, and He said, just kidding, you're not going to use it for anything. And that sent me into the deepest season of depression that I have experienced in life. I felt like the only purpose that I had been clearly given was gone. And then the whole world shut down, and that kind of messed with everybody. Then with our kids, I still struggle. It's been a year since our last little boy left, and man, when you find your identity in being a mom, that's a good thing. That's a gift from the Lord. But when that becomes more important than your identity in the Lord is when it becomes dangerous. Not only did I lose the identity of being the mom to those specific kids who were such an important part. I mean, Will and I both, we don't just halfway do something. If we're going to do something, we're going to give it everything we have. And so every bit of our free time and energy and creativity was spent on making the best possible memories we could with these kids at the end of every day, every single weekend. And when all of that is stripped away, it just leaves a void that I can't explain. And then also, so when we moved here, we, of course, lost the home that we had raised our family in by moving. I had to change jobs because we moved too far, so I lost my identity as a therapist. And we also ended up losing all of our children. So functionally, if you take a snapshot of what our lives looked like a month after living here versus a year before, it really felt like Job. It felt like everything that we had of meaning was gone. And it was for a good thing. It was something that the Lord obviously called us to. But that didn't change the pain of feeling like God had just stripped everything away that we found meaning in.
So obviously, a lot of that is difficult to deal with as you process and you realize these things that have been so important to me all of a sudden are either no longer relevant in this season or they're no longer there. And there's a transition, there's a change. And so then the question involved with that is, how did you cope with this change from the emotional and spiritual perspective?
Thanks. I forgot the question. Honestly, I did not cope very well with most of it. I spent a lot of time pouting. I just was so frustrated with the Lord that I had seemingly done everything that I could to follow the steps that He had laid out. And all of the things that I had found my identity in were things that we were called to. They were good things. They were things with the purpose of serving the Lord. And it really took a long time, a really long time, to feel like I could even talk to Him about it. And just really coped by shutting down and shutting off from everything around me, because I thought, if I don't let anything close to me, then nothing can hurt me. And that's absolutely not the truth and not a way to live. But it really took months and months. I was still diligent and still going to the Lord every single day, but it's kind of like when somebody that you're in a close relationship with has hurt your feelings. You might be able to sit with them in person, but you don't have anything to say. And that's just kind of how it felt for a long time, is I felt like He had let me down and disappointed me. And I kept coming, and I'm so, so thankful that He gave me the space and gave me the time to be frustrated and to be upset. God doesn't demand that we put on a happy face and that we come all put together and pretend like nothing hurts or bothers us. He gave me those months of just sitting with me. And I'm so appreciative because I learned so much more about Him during those months of silence and space than I think I possibly could have if He had, forced me to grow through it and not actually sit in the grief.
All right, so you mentioned that you learned a lot about him, so that leads into the next question. What lesson specifically did God teach you through this particular season?
I think that one of the biggest lessons is kind of what I was just saying. We culturally, as a church, just tend to give the impression, at least, that God doesn't want us to ask questions. God doesn't want us to hurt. He just wants us to pretend like everything's okay, come back to Him because it's all in His plan. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned in that is that God's here for the real. He's here for the raw. He sees and He already knows our hearts. He already knows the pain that we're going through. And we're just deceiving ourselves to try to put up a front with Him and act like things aren't hurting. Um, you can't really grow in relationship with somebody that you're not willing to be vulnerable with. And I spent a lot of years of my life not even allowing myself to be vulnerable with the Lord, let alone any other person. And you can't ever be fully known or fully loved if you're not willing to be fully vulnerable.
Thank you. And then the final question, what would you say to others who may be encountering similar circumstances or in a season similar to the one that's been described?
I would say allow yourself to just sit in whatever it is that you're experiencing. Allow other people to sit in that with you and trust that the Lord is going to do something with it. We may not always know what that is. We might not ever, we always say, oh, eventually we'll know why we went through that. We might not. And we have to just be okay with that. We have to be okay with the fact that the Lord sees the bigger picture when we do not. We just have to have the faith and trust in Him. But that doesn't mean that we have to blindly go through as if everything's okay, because it's not always okay.
All right, so I know that was rather quick. I didn't tell her or say that I was going to explain this or to share this part of our story or the journey of which we are currently in, but it's something that is so beautiful about this that I think could be encouraging to you. You hear from Laura Claire about this season of just kind of sitting, just being present with the Lord, but also not really knowing how to be open with the Lord, experiencing such a very deep hurt and feeling like almost what we thought was the Lord's plan and we're so convinced was what He was going to do with our family or whatever that may have pertained to, all of a sudden seeing something drastically different and impacting a number of areas of our lives. I'll never forget, and again, I didn't tell her I was going to share this, but she probably knows where I'm going with this. But I do want to encourage you through sharing this portion of this specific story and journey. So I'll never forget, we were here, and I had come home one night. It was a Tuesday night. The previous Monday night, Laura Claire and I were there. I could tell Laura Claire was down, and she's struggling a little bit. We're still deep into this season at this point to a degree. And she's just talking about, I just don't even, in tears, I just don't feel like the Lord even hears me. I don't feel like the Lord is listening. I feel so frustrated. And I'll never forget, we kind of talked through that night, had a lengthy conversation, and we go to bed, wake up the next day, we go throughout the next day of life. And that evening, I had something going on. I come home, and she's like, hey, let's have a bucket of ice cream together. Not a bucket, but we sat down and had ice cream together. And so what's funny about this, I'll have to tell a backstory, I guess. But anyways, long story short, we're really struggling during this season, kind of wrestling with God. We thought you were going to do something different than what has actually taken place. Kind of like what I talked about with Habakkuk when I preached through Habakkuk. When faith and experience intersect and the two do not necessarily align with what we think about God, and sometimes we can be so convinced this is what God is doing, and then our experience in life turns out to be something completely different than what we had convinced ourselves was the Lord's will. So that night I come home and she says, let's have this ice cream day. And so I'm eating ice cream and I'm looking at her, and then there's something hard in my food. And I'm like, what is this? And it's a little bitty plastic baby. And I'm like, are you trying to tell me something? Like, what is this?
It's a Mardi Gras cake, baby.
So, long story short about this little baby, when we first got married, I don't know, we had gone to, I want to say it may have been like a pregnancy.
Baby shower.
Oh, it was a baby shower. Okay, I was going to say it was a banquet for pregnancy crisis center that we got those. Anyways, a baby shower, so that's even better. Glad she remembers that. Long story short, she kept this baby, and then she would hide it in something that I would find it in, something of my stuff. And then I would take that baby, and I would hide it. And then we just kind of had this game back and forth. I hadn't seen that baby in like 5 years. I don't know where she was keeping it. I don't know, but she was saving that thing. And long story short, I was speechless in that moment because we'd been wrestling. God, our family doesn't quite look the way that we thought that it would at this point. Like, what's going on? We were convinced of this, and then it doesn't look that way. And, even the conversation the night before, I feel like he doesn't hear me, and I'm frustrated with what's going on, and I don't really know how to deal with this. And then there's kind of this answer lingering there that we didn't even know about yet.
Well, in that night before, the one line that just kind of ended the whole conversation was, I feel like I need some kind of sign from the Lord that he is listening to me, that he hears me, that he sees me in this grief of the loss of my kids. And the very next day is when we found out that we were having a baby.
So we share that simply to let you know, number one, as you've heard tonight, there are several things through seasons that we go through unintentionally. Not that we ever set out to become our identity, not that we ever set out to become who we are, but through the process, they become really important to us. And if we're not guarded and we're not prioritizing our relationship with the Lord, perhaps more than all of these other roles and these other things, it's very easy for us to become more caught up in those things than it is to be caught up in the Lord and who he is and who he's created us to be. That ultimately may be a tool. Those things may be tools that he uses our lives through, but never meant to be our identity.
And that's something that one of the things that I wrestled with was that each of these things were God-given roles. These were good things. Like I know for a fact he created us to be parents. Our functional role was to be parents with these kids. But the issue was that that's who I became. Over and over I've done this. I became a music therapist, and that's the only thing that I was. I'm all in everything I do. And then that falls apart and then doesn't leave anything. If I'm all in as a mom, then for a few months, that role completely left. And so then what are you left to do? You're just left with ashes. And that's also one of the biggest things that I've learned is that my identity is in Christ. My identity is not circumstantial. My identity is to love the vulnerable people of the world. And that can look different in different seasons. So that way, when those seasons change, I'm not losing who he created me to be. It just is going to look a little bit different in every single season.
I don't need to add anything to that. The purpose of this tonight was for you to hear from my wife a little bit. You hear from me quite frequently, but I don't know that she's had an opportunity to really share much about her life on this level. Perhaps some of you know bits and pieces. Some of you know even probably parts of that story. But as I talked with her last week and as I was thinking and praying through, the Lord just impressed upon my heart, perhaps there's somebody that's going to be there that would resonate with more than maybe you moving on to the next section of Ecclesiastes. And so I just asked her about that, and I should publicly thank you for being willing to do this because, as she mentioned, this is outside of her comfort zone. But I'm so thankful, number one, to get to do life with her, for her to be my partner and my supporter and just my soulmate, and to do life with her, to do ministry with her, and to know that she's there. But also, not just in the good times, but in the bad times, to get to see the hurt and to get to be present in that and to wrap my arms around her and to love her through the tears. And so I just encourage you, wherever you are, number one, draw near to those that are dearest to you. Don't neglect the opportunity to do that. Some of you may have lost someone close to you, and you realize how short time can be, but also how quickly things can change. And so don't neglect the opportunity you have to lean into those that are closest and dearest to you. But then secondly, don't just love them in the good times. Walk with them and be present with them. One of the hardest things for me as a pastor is when I go home, although I understand I'm also their pastor at home, but I'm husband and I'm friend, and during different seasons I've been dad, and to realize a lot of times they're not looking for me to fix their life. They're not looking for me to give answers. They just want me to know them and to be present with them. And so maybe you don't have that struggle, but I would encourage you, just even in the moments that don't feel so good, maybe the things that have been the most important to you have been stripped away. Maybe you feel like they're no longer what they once were. Lean into that season. Even when you don't feel like God is near or he's not listening, think of the story of Esther, where nowhere in the book of Esther is God's name recorded directly. But yet if you read Esther, his fingerprint is all over the story. And so maybe it is that you're in this season where you're in an identity crisis. The things that have been so important to you have been stripped away. Maybe it is that you're wrestling with that. Or it could be that it's not that you're in an identity crisis, but maybe it is that you're in a desert season in your relationship with the Lord, where you feel like you're just crying out, but you don't really hear him or feel that he's near, or that he's listening, or that he's answering what you're saying. I just encourage you, as you've heard from her, don't be discouraged and quit leaning in. Lean in even closer to the Lord. And in due season, not on your timeline, not on my timeline, not the way we would expect an answer, but according to his good and perfect plan, he will answer, and in his good and perfect timing. And so, again, I thought this conversation was very relevant to our study of Ecclesiastes, the pursuit of purpose, all of these different things we talk about that Solomon sought his identity in, his purpose in, and maybe you can relate. But I thought maybe it would resonate with you a little different hearing from a story of an individual as well. And so, again, thank you so much for being willing to share. And again, thank you for being my partner and best friend in life and in ministry. And church, thank you for letting us serve you and to be present with you and to love you and to walk with you through different journeys that life will carry you through. Not all journeys are easy, but the best ones are the ones that we come out on the other side stronger, better. And the only way we truly grow in our trust is to keep trusting and to keep waiting and to keep leaning in. So I want to pray for us this evening. And you know what? Actually, I want to ask Laura Claire, would you be willing to pray for us? And then we'll be dismissed. But again, thank you, church, for letting us serve you, to love you, and to be present with you. And I don't know as much as her. I feel like I can speak for us both. But if there are any questions that you have about our stories or anything, we're, or at least I am, an open book. So never be afraid to come and ask a question. Now, I'll tell you as always, I may not have all the answers. But if you want to know more about a particular season, you say, something you said really resonated with me, and I want to know a lot. Maybe I'm going through something similar or whatever. Don't be afraid to come and talk with us and to ask those questions, because if we can do anything to help you, to pray with you, even if it's just walking alongside you, we want to do that. So would you pray for us, and then we'll be dismissed.
Dear God, thank you so much for each of the people that you've brought here tonight. Lord, I don't know what's going on in each of their stories, but I know that you are working something for good for each person in this room. And God, I just pray for honesty and vulnerability and openness for each person, that we wouldn't feel like we have to have it all together for the people around us or for ourselves, but especially not for you, God. I pray that we would be willing to just sit in the mess of a broken world and bring our broken hearts to you. God, I just pray that we would find our ultimate meaning and purpose in you and who you've created us to be. God, I know that you call us to so many great things, but I pray that we wouldn't prioritize any of those great things